Anyone in the waiting room? Okay, so I think I'll get started if everyone's okay with that. Okay. So even though we're a very intimate group, it seems, for a little while anyway, we'll see how people join us as we move along. I still want to make proper introductions, so thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Greater Sacramento NAACP, Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, Sacramento Jewish Film Festival, Sacramento Faces Race, and the Jewish Community Relations Council, thank you for attending tonight's social justice film series panel discussion. On our double feature, Suppress 2020, The Fight to Vote, and Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that as nonprofit organizations, we do not endorse the comments of our panelists or viewers. We do not endorse candidates for office. Any discussion that is perceived as partisan should not be construed as an endorsement. With that said, some housekeeping. We have Judy Hyman supporting the panel with technology. Hi, Judy, thank you. And Tevin Laxer supporting us in the chat. And Tevin will be using your questions in the chat to engage with our panelists a little later in our discussion. So thank you, Judy and Tevin, for helping to create this wonderful film series. As leaders with our above mentioned community partners, it's very much appreciated. My name is Lynn Berkeley-Baskin, and I will be your moderator for this evening's panel discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Next, and before we welcome our panelists formally, please note that this panel discussion is being recorded. So now I'd like to welcome formally Justin Meszler. Justin is a high school junior in Sharon, Massachusetts, and the Deputy Campus Organizing Director for Reclaim Our Vote. Although he is not old enough to vote in the upcoming election, he still wanted to make his voice heard. After learning of tactics that states use to suppress voters of color, Justin realized that those with the privilege of living in a state with less voter suppression have the unique obligation to help those who do not have that same opportunity. In the spring of 2020, Justin joined Reclaim Our Vote and has since organized postcarding and phone banking efforts both locally and nationally. Justin has filled in at the very last moment for a Reclaim Our Vote partner who couldn't make it. So special thanks to Justin for stepping in so late in the game. We really appreciate it, Justin. And believe it or not, my screen is frozen, and here it goes. Welcome, LaMills Garrett. LaMills Garrett is a father, community collaborator, entrepreneur, veteran, and consummate advocate for justice. The dichotomies of the first half of his life being in the US South and the second half being in Colorado and California largely inform his views on today's topic. LaMills currently serves as a delegate to the California Democratic Party, a board member of the Placer Food Bank, the political action chair on the executive committee of the Greater Sacramento NAACP. Mr. Garrett is also a current candidate for Roseville City Council. Welcome, LaMills. We really appreciate you being here as well. And last but not least, Mac Heller. Mac Heller is a co-executive producer of the feature documentary Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. Angered by the wave of vote suppression tactics sweeping the nation over the past decade, Mac decided 4 years ago to make a film that would raise awareness of this threat to American democracy. Extreme racial and partisan gerrymandering, egregious documentary requirements to register and/or to vote, the elimination of polling places, and a million other dirty tricks to make it difficult or impossible for some American citizens to vote. Mac Heller retired from Goldman Sachs and Company in 2002, where he had been the head of worldwide mergers and acquisitions, co-head of the investment banking division, and a member of the management committee. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Mac, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We know that this obviously was both a labor of love and hate, hate for what's going on perhaps. So I'm going to start the questions with you. So welcome everyone, and start the questions with you. Specifically, Mac, actually before we get started, I want to make something really very clear for everyone, for the panelists in particular. If you would like to take these questions in some place where we haven't discussed, please do. There's been lots of discussion about what's going on today and how this is relevant, certainly to the racial issues that are going on in our society. So please feel free to tie it back in any way you'd like. But I would like to start with you, Mac, and ask this question. I want to ask you about Mark McKinnon. He's worked for Republican politicians like President George Bush and Senator McCain, worked with people in the performing arts and philanthropy like Bono, and even the late Governor Ann Richards, a Democrat. Ideologically, what do you see as the common thread with his participation in this film?
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks everybody for gathering tonight to talk about this crucially important topic at this crucially important time. Mark McKinnon, to me, is an articulate representative of a lost group of Republicans who recognize the heritage of that party as being important in the voting rights movement, believe that the Republican Party, and Mark says this in the film, had a choice after 2008, and then frankly again after 2012, not so much after 2016, which is to create a bigger tent, to bring in through issue stands and outreach and some change in attitude, a broader group of American citizens who would consider themselves Republicans, or to take another course, which would be to focus more on policies and attitude, comment, style that many Americans would view as unwelcoming. And Mark regrets that the Republican Party took that second course. And he regrets it, A, because he thinks it's wrong, but B, because he thinks it's a losing strategy. Ron Klain in the film, historical Democratic operative, Biden advisor, says that strategy may work for a while, but not forever. But what if a while is a very long time? And it worked in 2016, creating exclusion of the other immigrants, people of color, poor people, young people, but focusing a huge tribal emphasis on a smaller group of people, mostly white. And the Republican Party at this point shows no signs of changing that strategy. McKinnon is an outlier. The number of outliers is shrinking, not growing. Their power is shrinking, not growing. We'll see what happens in this election this year.
Yeah.
We thought he was a good voice because I'm old enough to remember the Republican Party being a very big part of the way that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 65 and 64 got passed. And old enough to remember the Democratic Party as the party of segregation in the South. So nothing lasts forever. Everything is subject to change, either for good or ill. And that's where the personal effort of everybody on this call becomes very, very important.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've kind of touched on how many of us felt when we were watching Rigged, or perhaps after watching Rigged, is that there's a sense of hopelessness, right? What do you do afterwards? And so what is a realistic voter rights playbook, and how can those who want to preserve our democratic principles be as effective as those who seek to subvert it? And you've spoken a little bit, but how do we do this?
Well, I imagine LaMills and Justin will have important elements to add to this, so I'll just consider a short comment to start it out. On our website, riggedthefilm.com, we have something we call the Democracy Playbook. They do this, we do that. on every single issue. This takes place at the states. Relatively little of this, other than a big bullhorn, takes place at the federal level. Some takes place in the federal courts. I think anyone who was expecting the federal courts to continue to play a role protecting voting rights is getting it wrong. This is a battle to be fought at the states, in the state legislatures, especially with redistricting coming in 2021. And so the good news is that activism, state by state, issue by issue, county by county, matters. What really matters at this point, registration, protecting the right to vote of those already registered, and getting people out to vote. That's what matters. The function of the film is to show that 8 or 9 different things are the same thing. They're all an effort to marginalize certain communities of American citizens. And so the educational element of the film, helping people say, oh my God, these things are all strung together. That's really important as you look at these states, especially like North Carolina, Texas, Georgia, et cetera, where vote suppression is really happening because it really matters and it works. So with that, I'll back off and hope LaMills and Justin can add to my comments.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. I think, Justin, would you take it first? Because I think that Reclaim Our Vote is specifically addressing what Mac is discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, vote. Register to vote if you're not already, and check your registration, especially if you've moved or haven't voted recently. And then get your friends and family to vote. Make sure they're registered to vote. And even if you think that they're very civically engaged, it still doesn't hurt to check, because you might be surprised. And then after you've done that, you can work with us at Reclaim Our Vote to register other people and get out the vote in other states that disproportionately prevent people of color from voting, with restrictive photo ID laws and understaffed polling places and all the voter suppression tactics and laws that have been put into place.
Thank you. LaMills, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, so Mac was touching on some of the pieces regarding the suppression itself. And, you know, a key piece that I like to, well, I don't know if like is the right word, that I think we're forced to deal with is really around, or at least in my head, is around voter encouragement. And because all too often we see the suppression and we talk about the suppression, and the challenge of that is exactly what Mac was mentioning, is how do we do the opposite of it? How do we encourage voters? How do we make sure that that's happening? And so, as you know, in the Sacramento area, I started this past year with just, frankly, making sure that we have African Americans running for office. And that does something significant in that it forces people who normally would never be in the political arena at all to now actually look to their peers, their family, and their extended network to say, vote for me. It becomes personal. The whole idea of registration and getting involved becomes personal. So for those on the call, if you are aware of ethnic minority communities, I think the best thing to do for those communities in terms of getting them involved and registered to vote and active in that process is helping them run for office, identifying African Americans, Latina, or whoever in lower income communities, encouraging them to run for office completely changes the dynamic. And so I'm trying to model that myself, and it's painful, but it's necessary. It moves it makes progress. The other thing is local media. Local media is dying across the nation, and local media has always been the voice, especially in the African American community, whether that's been radio or whether that's been published, in terms of talking about issues that are happening down at City Hall that no one really knows about or understands, but putting it in terms that people actually realize and care about and say, holy crap, we're going to get down there and vote about this. And the more that we suppress local media, the more people don't know what's going on. And they just figure, oh, well, whatever's going to be is going to be. And that attitude or that response in itself is the best voter suppression that you can have. And so I'm not going to get into all the rest of it, but those are just a couple of things that I think that we start off with doing and thinking about how do we fight suppression with encouragement and giving them those options and tools to be ready to go and fight that.
So as we fight this, and Justin, I want you to chime in too. I think Reclaim Our Vote is actually doing phone calling right now in North Carolina. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we're
Talk about that a
actually,
little? Yeah.
yeah, so right now and our focus keeps changing as we get more contacts in different states. But right now we're calling into North Carolina, Arizona. We've just added phone banks in South Carolina, Alabama, and Florida. So we're calling registered voters, and it depends on the state, depends on the phone bank. But in some of them, we're calling people who have been taken off the voter registration list. So we're calling deregistered voters to let them know that they have been deregistered and to get them to re-register to vote. And that has been, while the contact rate is pretty low on those calls, because a lot of these people, the phone numbers that we have aren't going to actual live people, the calls that do go through have been, at least for me, really inspiring, just to be able to contact those voters and tell them that, hey, you've been taken off of the voter registration rolls. And then also to hear that from other people who have been phone banking, that those connections that are made even over the phone have been really motivating, both for them and then also for the people that they're calling. And then in addition to calling deregistered voters, we're also calling registered voters and active voters in states to give them important voting information. Just because of everything that's happening right now, there is voting laws that are changing to fit the pandemic, and how you vote and how you can register to vote just keeps changing, and it's different for every state. And a lot of people don't have the resources and don't feel prepared or knowledgeable enough to vote. So we're providing that information over the phone in phone banks, and then also through postcarding and soon enough text banking.
And are you also encouraging people? We know that there's a postal issue, right? The United States Post Office is under attack. And so are you encouraging people to use the post office and vote early? Are you talking with them about what's going on? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so we're really letting people make their own decision on whether they want to trust the post office to send in their mail-in ballot that way, to vote early, or to vote in person on election day. We are encouraging people to do either vote by mail or vote early rather than voting in person on election day, because we want to avoid long lines on November 3rd. But really what it comes down to is voting as soon as you can. Right now, I think it was yesterday, North Carolina started sending out their first absentee ballots. So election day isn't just November 3rd. It's election day from now until November 3rd. So we're really trying to get people to vote as soon as possible.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll be talking more about how to onboard help for that at the end of this discussion. So thank you so much, I appreciate it.
You know, Lynn, just if I could interject, there are still some crucial battles being fought in some crucial states about the mechanics of mail-in voting, and it's worth just telling people what's going on. The Georgia Board of Elections decided it would be a good idea in the pandemic to send an application for a vote-by-mail ballot out to every Georgia voter. Texas, same thing. And then the legislature in each case stepped in and said no. You might ask, why would they do that? But they did. That's being fought out. Within the mechanics of mail-in voting, there is litigation going on in about 15 or 18 states about requirements that absentee ballots have witnesses, which in a pandemic, probably a bad idea, or that your signature on your absentee ballot be notarized, which in addition to a bad idea sounds like a poll tax, because that costs a few bucks, right? Shouldn't cost you anything to vote. There is litigation about whether ballots are postage prepaid versus you need to put on a stamp. And especially for young people, you know, what's a stamp? But again, it's a 55-cent poll tax. I hate to be persnickety about this, but it's a 55-cent poll tax. You're gonna feed your kids or vote. I don't want anybody to decide not to vote for that reason. And finally, do the ballots have to be postmarked by election day or received by election day? Won't shock anybody on this call to hear that the mail system in communities of color is slower. than in affluent communities. So voters are forced to, with a mail-in ballot that has to be there by election day, are rolling the dice on however good the mail system is in that part of town. Not always a good bet. So these issues, which are stupidly micro, can involve tens of thousands of votes. And they're still being worked out due to public pressure, voter pressure in important jurisdictions in our country, Georgia being the foremost. So Georgia, Florida, Texas, these issues really matter.
And I think that also speaks to the importance, at least with the different methods for reaching out to voters, of phone banking more than postcarding or the other methods that we're using. Just because we were actually calling voters, we made some 200,000 calls or something ahead of the Texas primary runoff election a few months back. And back then, the voting laws just kept changing day by day. First, the people who were able to vote absentee were everyone, then a judge overruled that, and it just kept going up. And soon enough, only people over the age of, I think, 65 were allowed to vote by mail, or people who are out of the county, all through early voting and election day. So with the phone banks, we're easily able to go into the script and change it to update that information, rather than just sending out postcards with voting information. So phone banks are an easy way for us to adapt to the ever-changing voting laws landscape to provide the most accurate and up-to-date information.
Thank you. LaMills, I'll get to you in a second, but I just want to follow up with you, Justin. You know, if somebody doesn't feel comfortable, since we're talking about phone banking, if there's somebody who doesn't feel comfortable phone banking, is there an option for them, since postcarding is not necessarily encouraged at this point?
Yeah, so although we stopped recruiting new postcard writers around September, with the last postcards are going to be sent out around October 10th. And really our focus right now is phone banking. And from personal experience, I don't enjoy talking with strangers on the phone. It's not something that I get super excited about. Oh, I can't wait to sit down and make a bunch of calls to people. It's something that I do stress over. But pushing through that discomfort and really committing myself to that this work is important and that I can really make a difference, and that these people need to be provided with the most up-to-date voting information. Not need to, but many of them would definitely benefit from this information to know how to vote. That really overcomes, at least for me, that discomfort that I feel. And we do actually, and I can talk more about this at the end, have a specific webinar on Thursday dedicated to introverts and how to phone bank.
Oh,
And,
wonderful.
yeah.
Great. Oh, that's great to know. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit to LaMills, and we're going to go local. Although we know that a lot of what we're discussing, especially related to rigged and suppressed, is are about states and the states that have the most egregious voter suppression. But we do have some issues here in California. And so since we're Californians, we wanted to take just a moment to look at a state lens to focus on California's practice of legislating complex issues through ballot propositions and how they may impact voter exclusion. The first of two ballots we'll point out seem very straightforward. It directly relates to the question of right to vote, and that's Proposition 17. And LaMills, again, I'm directing this to you. And that would amend California's constitution to allow people who are on parole for felony convictions to vote. The other is Proposition 25, which the NAACP strongly opposes, and I know that you're here under that hat as well. And it would replace money bail with a fair, safer, and less costly process. So it sounds great. That's what a yes vote would do. But the new process that would replace money bail has severe intended and unintended consequences that would increase mass incarceration and racial oppression. certainly at the local level and at the state level. It involves a risk assessment tool that many people are saying are inherently biased. Based on that risk assessment, accused individuals could be detained without the option of bailing out or put on de facto probation before they've been convicted of a crime. So having said all of that, how do you think having Proposition 25 and Proposition 17, not to mention the other propositions and local measures, which you're welcome to bring into this if you'd like, affect voter participation and their impacts on communities of color or poor people? And second part, when there are seemingly compelling arguments, both sides, and a lot of propaganda, where can voters get clear, unbiased analysis to make informed decisions?
Good.
So it's two parts.
Goodness gracious.
I know.
So,
I tried to set it up and frame it.
well, that last piece, is the true unbiased information. It's like, oh, bless us. I'm back in the South now. It's like, oh, bless your heart. And so, first off, before I say anything, Justin, I want to say thank you for the work that whatever has motivated or inspired you to do the work that you're doing at the age that you're doing it, and to be engaged at this point. I want to send my thanks to you in a very real and personal way, because the states that you're talking about, I'm originally from Columbia, South Carolina. That's my home. I do tons of work there from a distance point of view, and at least with family network and connections. And it means a lot to have someone out of state understanding those things. And frankly, it's hard enough to get a 40, 50-year-old person to do the work or even think that it's important, not to mention someone who hasn't even left high school yet. And so thank you so very much. Now, to the questions that I'm supposed to be answering. So one is hopefully it's very well understood that at least well, I guess I shouldn't say hopefully it's very well understood. Growing up in the South, something was understood for me was that African-American males were an especially easy target to be addressed and removed from the family unit, the work unit, and the community on a whim, and at the discretion of whatever the legal system demanded or needed at the time. And my family has a very personal connection with the legal system, and I say my family in South Carolina as well as family that I gained in Louisiana. And in that process, it became a very simple way in the zip codes of 29203 and 29204 in Columbia, South Carolina, to always make sure that a vote went a certain way. In terms of who could vote, where the polling place was going to be, how many people were actually registered to vote despite what the population was, because of how many of them actually were on parole or in prison or otherwise. And there was just a constant pattern of people who actually didn't live or wasn't engaged in our community who were oftentimes representing us. And so when I look at something like Proposition 17 that's happening in California here, it immediately, addresses for me that clear issue of the longer we can keep them on parole, the longer they are still a part of the criminal process, and thus we have the right to not allow them to vote, and thus they don't truly have a voice, even though they count as a part of the population, and we can use that as a part of our gerrymandering process. And so Proposition 17 is a clear move in the right direction, so that those who are on parole can vote, and to realize that, as pointed out in the movie Rigged, as pointed out in the movie 13, as pointed out in so many other places, that the idea that we can theoretically take the most basic right of a person away as a US citizen, which is to vote, for something that they've truly committed their time for in jail, and now they are out, theoretically now providing in a positive way to the community, and say that because we're on this parole that they can't participate in the most basic definition of your citizenship, is just ridiculous. And I think there's even some question that should be brought up on for some of the offenders who are in jail. But we'll have that discussion for another day.
Absolutely.
And so Proposition 17 is a easy human rights bill. That it's nothing but a human rights bill for any democracy. Proposition 205 is a really good game. It's appealing on its face. Proposition 205, which is essentially addressing the issues of money bail. And money bail is a tragic issue that affects so many people so often. The way I view it is money bail becomes the ultimate poll tax for ethnic minorities. So if you get arrested for anything, and we oftentimes forget that arrest doesn't equal guilt. We oftentimes go through a process and say, oh, they got arrested and they're being held in jail. And so there's oftentimes an assumption by the public that because the police arrested you and because you are in jail, then thus you are guilty. And then you add on top of that the necessity of paying a given amount of money in order to get out. Oftentimes, the communities that are over-policed and over-targeted are so because they don't have the voice to push back on the policing that's happening within their community. So they become an easy target. And in that process, you then find those individuals or individuals within that community, be they right or wrong, being arrested, whether it be for very minor charges or truly things that make a difference. But that bail amount for an accumulation of tickets for jaywalking in Sacramento, for public drunkenness, for loitering, for any set of things that then you then are hit with a bail on top of that, the likelihood of you being able to, one, afford the bail is a low likelihood. Now, what you are paying or what you are contributing to as a now, I guess we'll call it incarcerated person, you're now contributing to our tax dollars, paying significant amounts of dollars for you to be there, and for companies to be enriched off this in some way, shape, or form, and for many people to get paid, even though there's no validation of you being guilty of your crime or otherwise. In the meanwhile, we now say we want to get rid of that system. And so Proposition 205 says we're going to help you get rid of the system, which is a great thing. What it then does is says that instead of placing a number associated with bail or even giving that leverage necessarily to a judge, we're actually going to work with typically the DA's office, and we're going to actually apply, I should say the prosecutor's office, DA, and we're going to apply a risk assessment based upon who you are and what the likelihood of you getting out or doing wrong again from our point of view to determine whether or not you actually should be released or not, or what the terms of this should be. Our issue isn't at all with replacing money bail. We think money bail should be eliminated at all. The risk assessment tool, however, then brings about, in any risk assessment tool, typically it's not culturally sensitive in any way, shape, or form. It's also not looking into the factors of well, if this person is in this community, if they've been picked up, if they've been stopped, if they've had interaction with the police, et cetera. Well, for me, living in a community called East Roseville, Granite Bay, it is far less likely that my son is ever going to have an interaction with the police in any way, shape, or form, positive, negative, or frankly, with a theoretical gang member, than someone who's living in downtown Roseville or in South Sacramento or in Del Paso Heights or in Oak Park. However, if that risk assessment tool is applied to them both equally on the scenario, for a common situation, it is highly likely that my son, hopefully, will get a better outcome than someone who grew up in those communities, simply because of the likelihood of them having an interaction with those things that would be considered risky to the police and or law enforcement than for my son. And now I say that and in my community, I live in a very white community, and very affluent community. And thus, when we look at the risk assessment tool, it actually provides a significant amount of threat to the community than the likelihood of going different directions. And so right now, when we look at Proposition 17, it's a no-brainer for us of we need everyone obviously behind that and supporting it. Proposition 205 right now, we're a no on it. We don't support it because we're essentially replacing one bad with another tool that actually encourages the use of tools that have already shown to negatively impact ethnic minority communities, low-income communities, and otherwise. And it's tough having to make that decision, to be perfectly honest, because in context, there's still the piece out there of potentially someone may, still yet have to fall into situations of dealing with money bail. And we know how that already has a negative context. And so that is challenging. And I will add to that that is also personally challenging, just the idea of someone being held in general because of my own family situation. Whereas I have a son who has been incarcerated for 14 years now and has 61 more years to go with no chance of parole for a crime of armed robbery where he never inflicted pain on anyone, where it was a conspiracy, where no one got hurt, where no one was touched, where there was no physical contact with anyone, and he got 75 with no parole, 75 years with no parole, because they considered him a habitual offender, i.e., which is the same type of tool that will be used within the risk assessment tool. And his two priors were possession of a single marijuana joint. And so from a personal point of view, as well as being engaged with the community and seeing the types of things and how the rules under Proposition 25 can be used are drastically wrong. And if we bring all of that back is within a community that already doesn't vote often enough, this creates a scenario whereas there's an expectation that you can't vote and that your vote doesn't matter. And look at what our vote gets us when we look at the people and the rules that are actually coming out of the process. So I've talked way too much, but I'll be quiet now. Lynn.
No, I appreciate you bringing it all back and helping us connect the dots to voting, right? Because when someone is, and different states have different rules about who votes inside or outside. So it's not just about California, but throughout our country, we deny the vote to those who are incarcerated all over this country for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes that is also, if somebody did plan on voting, they get picked up on that day. It would be an interesting thing to see, right? To correlate how many people are actually taken out of the community on the days before voting.
And that's even interesting because, in that context, this is part of the fight that we had with the census. If you're participating in the census and you're counting your child, the count of the census means millions of dollars for communities, millions of dollars. If you're in a community, and I mentioned a few in the Sacramento area, whereas a given number of people from that community are actually in jail, but not yet sentenced. Despite them being in jail and not yet sentenced, they have to be counted at the jail. That's where they are actually counted. They're not counted as a part of their community. So they haven't been found guilty. They haven't been found guilty of a charge, but their census information will be counted by the jail as a resident of that zip code of that area, which is typically not in the Black community that their dollars would actually be going back to. And so then those very same numbers are then given to actually draw the lines of population or otherwise. And so those areas like downtown Sacramento will get an inflated number of African Americans who don't really live there.
Thank you so much, LaMills.
As a part of their overall vote count. So will Elk Grove, and so on. And so it has real impact. completely.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to take the next few minutes and turn it over to Tevin. If there are anyone who's in the chat or has questions, you certainly put it in the chat, and we can engage our panelists in those questions. And so Tevin, thank you.
Sure. Well, can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to turn up the mic here. So just before I get started, Lynn, just a few things I want to say. I want to thank Lynn and Judy for helping to produce this social justice series that we're part of. We just started within the past week. We have 5 main sponsors of the Social Justice Film Festival. We have the NAACP. We have Sacramento Faces Race. We have the Sacramento Jewish Film Festival, which I am the director of. We have the JCRC, that's the Jewish Community Relations Council. And we have CV-HEN, which is the Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network. So I wanted to give a shout out to all 5 of the co-sponsors, and again, in particular, Lynn and Judy for helping with not only this panel, but for other logistical things during our festival. I also want to thank our panel members for being here today. We really appreciate it. And of course, everyone here in the audience, we appreciate you being here as well, taking part of your Labor Day to be with us. And before I get to the questions, I just want to mention something too, just personally. So, you know, some of you know me as the director of the Jewish Film Festival, but I also want to mention that, you know, I so appreciate what Justin is doing in particular. I too started out when I was in high school, way back in the 60s, and I have worked in every election since 1964, either paid or unpaid. And it's just something that I love doing, and it's part of my DNA. So a great shout out to all of you who help in our campaigns, helping to get out the vote. So with that, I see a couple more questions in the chat, but I'll start in order. The first was a question/statement about phone banking and texting, and whether you use your own phone number or if you get another phone number from which to make the phone calls. Some people may be a little, may not want to use their own personal number. So if one of you can take that question, that's the first one.
Hold on one second, Tevin, if I could interrupt. So at the end of this, Justin will be talking about all of these questions. If we could hold those to the end when Justin will be onboarding folks, that would be helpful.
Okay, I was just taking them in a random order here.
I hear you.
Well, not random, but in the actual order. Okay, so this again is a question/suggestion coming from Dorothy Landsberg, who is suggesting that her husband Brian talk about the Florida felon case, since Brian is heavily involved in that litigation. So I'd like to turn if it's okay with everyone, to have Brian talk about what's the status of the ballot measure in Florida. Some of you may have heard about. Perhaps Brian could talk about the ballot measure and then what happened with the ballot measure and what happened with the litigation that he's involved in.
Well, this goes really directly to Mac's playbook that I didn't know about, and when he mentioned it, I went and got my my iPad and looked at it, and so it's very useful, and it talks about what do we do about voter suppression. And one of the things he mentions is to support organizations that are engaged in litigation, because a lot of the voter suppression is vulnerable to well, a lot of it is going to violate the Constitution or the laws of the United States, and therefore you just need to have the capacity to challenge it in court. So this is a very unusual case. The voters of Florida voted to restore voting rights to felons once they had served their terms, and so felons in Florida thought that, okay, now we can register to vote. But then the Florida legislature enacted a law that said before you can register to vote, you have to pay off all of your fines and also all of the court fees and of court costs associated with your case. And but we don't really know what your court fees and costs are. You have to find out. So and it's very difficult for the felons to find that out. They go down to register and they're asked, well, have you paid off your court fees and fines, your fines and costs? They know what their fines are, but they don't know what their fees and court costs are. So this was challenged in a federal court, and a federal district court held basically that the requirement to pay off the fees and costs was tantamount to a poll tax. I think you mentioned, one of you mentioned the cost of a stamp being a poll tax. Well, this same idea. And so that federal court held that it was a poll tax, and the state of Florida appealed and asked for a stay of that order pending appeal. And the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed the trial court's holding order and set the case down for argument and for briefing and argument. And I worked on a friend of the court brief supporting the plaintiffs who want the right to vote in that case. The case was argued, I think it was August 17th, I think, and we're waiting for a decision in the case. So that's an example of, I think, of voter suppression, and also of the importance of organizations having the some of the organizations that ordinarily you would have thought would bring a case like this didn't, and I think it's partly because lack of resources. So that's just one example of a voter suppression method and what some people are trying to do to deal with it.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And the next question, I'm not sure if this is for the next section also, but I'll pose it, and if necessary, we can hold it to the third part of this. And that is, the questioner wants to know, what are some of the best get out the vote strategies? And she would like to have each panelist answer the question, especially amongst immigrant communities. So is that something we want to answer now or later?
I think you go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think Justin's coming up very shortly. Anyway, we don't have a lot of time left, so Justin will be coming up shortly anyway. So go ahead.
Go ahead now or later?
Sure, go for it.
Go for it. Okay, so panelists, what are your suggestions for get out the vote?
And did I hear that correctly, for immigrant communities?
Could be any, yeah, in particular immigrant communities, but just in general, what are some of the best strategies for getting out the vote?
I think the best strategy is always meeting them where they are and where they congregate. That's number one. And so in those populations, religion typically is a high attractor. And so partnering within immigrant communities is, we'll just start with the Latina, the Hispanic community, partnering typically with the Catholic Church, and making sure that we have English speakers that also speak their language, and more so probably someone who speaks their language who also speaks English, I should say, and as a avenue for communication, as a partnership, and then building it around that. So whether it be around setting up scenarios where you then have either phone banking, i.e. what Justin and team are doing from there to make sure that there's early engagement, and then following that up with communications that are actually happening within their place of religion that actually gives them updates, as well as in their community, in their language. And then lastly, having a coordinated effort that feels safe from a transportation perspective, in terms of getting to the polls. And I have to stress the piece of feeling safe, because we may think that, oh, well, if they're able to vote, then they're a citizen, then we don't have any issue here, so why are we concerned? Well, typically people in immigrant communities live amongst some people who are also in immigrant communities who may not be citizens, and who will feel very threatened by various people or the presence of anything that they feel that might threaten their status here in any way, shape, or form, or simply the likelihood of them being able to continue to maintain their livelihood. So I think we have to apply thought from their point of view, starting off with that. And when I say meeting them where they are, understanding and addressing it from the language perspective, from the safety perspective, and especially in today's time. If we think that we're just going to go and walk up to someone at the local flea market or, exchange or whatever the case and say, hey, help me understand you, and we talk, and I want to help you to vote kind of thing, that's kind of an exaggeration, they're going to be running from us. So we have to put somewhat of a coordinated effort in that that actually meets them with their community. And I think the best place is within their place of worship.
Great. Thanks. Mac, how would you answer that question?
I adopt everything LaMills said. I agree. We have to be sensitive to what some people in these communities are going to be hearing between now and the election. There is more Facebook garbage and other garbage out there, that ICE is going to be at the polling place, that you can't vote if anybody in your house is undocumented, blah, 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 blah. And it's easy for me to shrug it off and say that's not true. But what are the consequences if that's wrong? By the way, the Republican National Committee has been prohibited from activities at the polling place since they entered a consent decree in the early 80s, because they had off-duty cops, packing guns at polling places, checking credentials. That consent decree is gone, and that party is raising money now to staff polling places. And I don't think they're talking about polling places in Greenwich, Connecticut. I think they're talking about polling places where the other side's going to vote, just to have a law and order presence, just to check credentials, just to challenge credentials where appropriate. And nothing will scare immigrant. Word gets around that there were armed agents, and the first guy didn't say it was ICE, but the second guy says it was, so we need to be sensitive to the kind of garbage that's going to be thrown at these communities and do whatever we can to counteract it. Safe is the word of the day.
Great, thank you. And Justin, your thoughts, please.
Well, I can't speak a ton to specific with immigrant communities. I mean, the most effective voter outreach method is relational organizing, is people reaching out to other people in their networks, their friends, their families, their local communities, saying, this is important, you need to get out and you need to vote. So that really connects to what LaMills was saying about partnerships with local organizations and faith groups and things like that, to show that this isn't some abstract thing happening on the national level. This is something that really affects your local community and something that you really need to turn out for.
Yeah, and I was just thinking when Mac was talking, so I serve on two boards here in Roseville. One is the Placer Food Bank, and another is the Roseville Police Activities League. And it was very interesting to find that in both situations, the Roseville Police Activities League is actually one of the places where we bring tons of youth, largely from immigrant families, oftentimes in the city of Roseville, where they come to get after-school activities. We work to broaden and build a positive relationship between that community and the police. And we have physical activities, tutoring, and all of these things. And just over a year, or actually just about 2 years ago, as things started going on with ICE, families discontinued the free program altogether. They were no longer attending. They saw the police as a possibility that they were going to be turning them into ICE, and that ICE was going to be using the facility as a place to actually get them. We saw agencies that uses the food bank that I'm a board member of actually saying that they were getting too much food for us because families stopped coming because they were worried that the agencies where they picked up the food was a target point of ICE. And so now families are literally going hungry. Their kids aren't learning. Their kids aren't getting all these things. And so they now have that as the backdrop. And now you have a family member or two that's going to go vote and potentially think that, oh, I go vote, and the potential is either I bring a family member with me or I go back home and someone follows me and I lose a family member because I voted. So we have a large barrier in front of us that we have to work through. And Justin said the exact word, the perfect word in terms of the relationship piece that actually has to happen. And so those are a couple of examples that I've already seen that brings fear. And Mac brought up the Republican Party, and we just saw this week in the county that I live in that the Republican Party created a website that was almost identical to the Placer County elections URL that they are going to be using as a targeted point to actually tell people this is where you come for information and what to vote and who to actually go to get information from, et cetera. So we're now in the process about to return them into the Secretary of State and to consider FEC and otherwise, and to get that pulled down. But these are the tactics that we're actually looking at already.
Great, thanks. So here's a question, I think, for LaMills about the voter suppression against felons. The question was, do you know what percentage of people in Sacramento, California, even the nation, who were denied the right to vote because of law enforcement activities?
Oh, wow. So then that would be parole rates, because everyone
Right.
who's in prison is disallowed. And so that would be our parole and jail rates. I don't know our parole and jail rates. I know in California, I think we have about 130,000 or so in prison, and about a little over 80,000 in local jails. And that, I think we got about another 7,000 to 10,000 in youth places, but they wouldn't count. So I can't do the numbers in my head just for that breakout for jail versus prison. And I don't know the parole rate either, so I have to apologize for that.
Okay.
But let me with Brian Landsberg throw out the Florida number, which is 1.4 million people
Right.
who either are or are not going to be able to vote because of this Florida reenfranchisement that's been challenged. 1.4 million people. So Florida has maybe 25 million. Let's say that 20 million of them are voters. So it's 7%. These are, and we live in a world we all know where, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania all went by 10 to 50,000 votes one way or the other in the 2016 election. And the proportion of people of color in these populations is higher than average. So
Yes.
none of this is a coincidence. You know, we haven't talked about the historical Jim Crow, you know, where these felon disenfranchisement laws come from is, for example, the North Carolina state constitution passed about 1900. And the intent of the purging statute that we show in the film, and of the felon disenfranchisement statute on the books in North Carolina is, in the words of the day, to cleanse from the voter rolls the handful of remaining African Americans still at that point brave enough to vote. And Black people could be charged with crimes that white people weren't charged for. And so a crime like vagrancy, and LaMills, you mentioned loitering, these, well, here's what the cop says kind of crimes were designed to just sweep up at that time, 1898, 1901, Black males still, crazy enough to decide they'd try to vote. And so the heritage of that, take it forward to Florida today, where the gerrymandered Florida legislature, which doesn't reflect even the voters of Florida, not to mention the voting population of Florida, because of this disenfranchisement of 1.4 million people. Well, this is a very deep hole, and the stakes are very large. And that's why the people who don't want these people to vote are just fighting at tooth and nail at every step.
So we'd like to now move to Justin and have Justin talk to us a bit about the Get Out the Vote activities. I just want to share just two things that were in the chat really briefly. There's concern, and this probably goes to the other film, the Suppressed 2020 film, where we are concerned about the removal of so many polling places, especially for minority communities. And in that film, you saw, for example, Milwaukee, where I think there were 3 polling stations where there were hundreds before, and you had lines that were ridiculous, throughout Wisconsin. And the other part, is my own comment really briefly. I have a 99-year-old mother in Florida, and her signature today is very different than when it was, say, 15 years ago when she registered to vote in Florida, when she moved from New York. And so we're concerned about all of the seniors or people with disabilities or whose signatures no longer match. And that's a problem in many states. But that said, let's talk about Get Out the Vote and motivating people to vote. I'll just also throw out one more thing personally, excuse me on this. We learned yesterday about a 75-year-old cousin of my wife who has never voted. And so the question is, how do we motivate someone, a 75-year-old woman who has never voted before? And I'll toss that to Justin with his motivation skills.
Thanks. So Reclaim Our Vote is, I mentioned a few of the states before, but we're working in North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, Arizona, and Texas. I think I got them all. To get out the vote, re-register deregistered voters, and contact low propensity voters of color in communities that are disproportionately affected by these voter suppression tactics. So far in 2020, with the help now of over 20,000 volunteers, we have sent 5 million postcards to these voters. And now we're pivoting more towards phone banking. And so far we've made 500,000 phone calls. So if you want to help be a part of that and contact voters in these states, I am going to put a link, let me find it very quickly, to sign up for the Reclaim Our Vote campaign. And there it is. And then if you're interested in phone banking, I would highly recommend that you come, if you're able, to our phone banking training for introverts and friends on Thursday. And let me put that information in the chat as well. So there it is. And Reclaim Our Vote chose these states that we're contacting for a few different reasons. First, each of these states has at least 20% of the voting population is eligible voters of color. So that is our main focus for the campaign of who we're reaching out to. And then also they have, the states have many of the voter suppression laws that we talked about that were in the two documentaries. And then also, most of the states, I believe all except one, have at least one Senate race in the upcoming election. So we're focused on all the different statewide elections, not just the presidential race. And I think that is it on that front, but there are also additional opportunities with Reclaim Our Vote if you are or know of student volunteers who might be interested in this work. We are currently in the process of recruiting campus ambassadors on high school and college campuses to represent us and organize their local communities to volunteer with us. So I'm putting a link in chat to a description of the Campus Ambassador Program and how to sign up. So if you know anyone who might be interested in that, or if you know of high schoolers who need community service hours, we also have that. Let me find that. There's a ton of forms here and a ton of different links, but that's for the high school community service. So we have a bunch of different volunteering opportunities for anyone who might be interested in this work. And to address a question from a little while back of how the phone banking works. So you don't have to use your own number if you do not want to. When you go into the system, and again, this is after watching a training video and possibly attending a training session with us where you can get all your questions answered about how to do this, you'll open up a virtual phone banking system where you'll see their number, their name, their gender, and a phone banking script. And you do not have to contact them with your own phone number if you do not want to. We have instructions for using Google Voice, which allows you to change your number possibly to the target state that you are contacting. So you can use that to change your number and call from a different number if you want. And again, there are more instructions on that once you sign up. And then with the text banking, which we're relaunching again in mid-September, so soon, that actually you can't use your own number because it is through a website from Text%, which was created by one of our partners called Democracy Labs. And on there, it's fully automated. It's clicking a few buttons and contacting voters and seeing their responses on there. So there's actually no way to use your own number with the texting.
Kevin, I'm going to offer two suggestions here. As both Justin and LaMills were saying, the way to get somebody to vote who hasn't voted or who is hesitant to vote is to find a trusted individual close to them. And that's the best conversation. Voting is the center of citizenship, so I don't know which cousin it is or which friend, but that's always going to work best. The sleeper thing that I've seen work is for a 75-year-old to get a young person to call them up. And I'm Judy from Chicago, and I'm a 21-year-old student at Northwestern, and I really want you to vote. And I'm here to walk you through the steps of it. You know, as with all things, asking them or yourself, why aren't they voting? Some people don't really understand this registration stuff, or they think there's some problem, or they think they might do something, you know, what is it that's going on? But finding the right person to hold their hand and walk through the steps of it. So that would be my thought there. Justin, to add to your comment, the studies show that if people are purged, it's very difficult to get them to re-register. They feel the system doesn't want them to vote, and so the point is to ideally have them never get purged at all. So one of the great things that Reclaim Our Vote is doing is catching people who are gonna be purged if they don't vote in another federal election. So that's one study. Another study says, with respect to young people, if they're not voting by the time they're 25, the likelihood they're gonna register and vote consistently after 25 is low. Voting is a habit, voting is family related, and many people, you know, that you meet and they're 47 years old and they don't vote, never voted, they just shrug their shoulders and say, my family never voted. So the part of me that's been dealing with the forces of voter suppression say, it's all a plan. If you can disenfranchise students, if you can disenfranchise young people, if you can make voting a pain in the you-know-what for the first 4 years after people turn 18, you know, and this is a generation that is used to doing things online. Well, you can't vote online. You know, all that stuff. You're creating, deliberately creating a whole generation of non-voters. I think that's horrible, but maybe that's what's going on. It's all the more important to fight the fight that Justin and his colleagues are fighting.
And just to speak to the effectiveness of Reclaim Our Vote, I have somewhere here on my computer pulled up that in 2019, Reclaim Our Vote sent around 350,000 postcards and made around 90,000 calls to voters in North Carolina and Virginia. And of that, in North Carolina's 3rd congressional district, 20 to 25% of the deregistered voters that were postcarded to actually re-registered before the September 2019 special election in North Carolina. So
that's awesome.
These campaigns are really effective, and they may not seem so at times when you're just sitting at home writing postcards, but they really do reach people.
Great.
Yeah, and you know, Justin's numbers bring up a point that, you know, I try to push to my network, is that communicate the positive and give people solutions to the negative. And what I mean by that is all too often, you know, especially now with the behavior that's going on and the mail and everything else, there's a meme a day that's created to tell people how Trump is going to try to screw up the election, how someone's going to mess up the election, and how, you know, voter suppression is going to hurt X number of voters and so on and so forth. That may very well be true. But I think the communication of that negative in itself becomes a form of suppression. And so we need to be cautious with pushing that out, allow that to inform you as an educated voter, and then be more focused on the solution that actually addresses that claim, and share the solution, or share the numbers of the work that has been done. People have been making calls and doing XYZ to make sure that we overcome the likelihood of people being pushed off voter rolls. That is a positive message that then people say, oh, if we do the right thing, our vote counts. If the right things are done, our vote counts. But if they constantly hear the message of voter suppression is going to happen, you know, this is definitely something that's going to happen at XYZ, we are going to find that we have actually equipped Donald Trump or whoever the person may be to come on November 4th and say, oh, the results aren't in yet. And people are going to say, oh, we know what we're going to happen. And they will become empathetic with the likelihood that it's going to go wrong anyway. And they'll accept that instead of having taken action to actually do the things necessary to make a change. So be careful in your communication on what you're putting out. Be careful on spreading the word of just blanket voter suppression and things are going to be bad, et cetera, and focus on the solutions and talking about the positives that are out there.
Well said.
Thank you, thank you. Well, thank you all. Before we close out, I'd like to give Tevin a moment and Judy a moment to update the community on anything that's pressing in the moment. No, not a long thing, but just for a minute or two here, and then we'll close out.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Again, just to thank everyone for being here. The only thing I want to say in closing is please visit our festival website, which is jewishsac.org/festival. /social justice. I can put that in the chat room. So again, thank you very
Great.
much. I'll put that in the chat room now.
Thank you. Thank you to remind everyone. And Judy, do you have anything?
I would just like to thank our panelists for taking the time to share your thoughts and knowledge with us. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees. And just let you know that we are going to be turning our attention to the election for the next couple of months, and we'll be getting word out about various learning opportunities regarding the statewide and local propositions. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you. And yes, so before I do say an actual goodbye, Justin, thank you so much for stepping in at the last minute. You were incredibly informative, and you're just such a great model for not just for our youth. I want to make it very clear. You are a model for all of us. And I truly thank you for that. So please keep in touch. I appreciate it. LaMills, you're my friend and partner at the NAACP, and I appreciate that. I wish you the best of luck in all you're doing, and please, I'm certainly at the local level, we can support your efforts in your different spaces. So thank you so much. And Mac, I'm hoping that what people do with Rigged is they take it and show it to others, and then we all connect them to Justin. That's what I'm hoping we can do with this. So please pass along Rigged. It's something very important for all of us. Panelists, thank you, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Please stay in touch with the film series. Have a good evening.
Best of luck with your Senate race, LaMills. Not your Senate, your city council.
Thank you very much.